Hey there, and welcome to a new thing on this channel. I've been delving into a bunch of different mecha anime for the last few years, and it's been something that I've really ended up enjoying. I'm about as far from an expert as you can be, but I do really enjoy discovering and then sharing these old series and franchises with others. While I find myself really gravitating towards the 80s with its gritty art and willingness to just be totally out there, there's many years preceding that decade with an ocean of media just waiting to be delved into. Now, while I really enjoy these dives into series where I go in depth with every individual arc, that's just impossible to do for everything out there. So what I'm going to do is go decade by decade and eventually year by year to give a breakdown of and small overview of tons of mecha media. Obviously, there's going to be stuff I miss just because of the sheer volume of what's available, but I'm going to do my best to take a look at what I can, all starting with the good old 1960s. While anime as a whole has its roots all the way back to the early 1900s, mecha as a subgenre actually got its start back in the 60s with adaptations of manga that were produced in the 1950s. While things like mecha with an interior pilot would become large parts of the genre later on, mecha anime would really begin with a little series called Astro Boy, and would go on to become one of the largest genres in the entire medium. And while mecha's time in the sun has waned in the last 20 years or so, it's actually kind of amazing how many shows still release under its banner. Whether it's something like Mobile Suit Gundam, The Witch from Mercury, or even technically Dragon Ball Super Superhero, it all has its roots back in the 1960s. To start off talking about anime from the 60s, we actually should go all the way back to the year 1952. Manga author Osamu Tezuka begins his run of Mighty Atom, a story serialized in Shonen magazine that would go on to become one of the most important works in animation history. Tezuka would go on to be called the Japanese Walt Disney, and mentored some of the most well-known mangaka in the history of the medium. His work on Mighty Atom would run for 16 years, spread over 112 chapters, but before the manga would end its run, Mighty Atom would be adapted into a TV anime in 1963. This was a huge deal. Mighty Atom was the first serialized animated show to air that gained any sort of lasting popularity. Before this were shows like Manga Calendar and other animated shorts, but now you could follow a story from episode to episode with recurring characters and themes and plot points. Mighty Atom began its Japanese run on January 1st, 1963, and it was in September of that year that the show would begin its broadcast on American television. Renamed Astro Boy in the States, the series would run on NBC and would prove to be quite popular. Overall, 104 English episodes were produced, and despite the English masters being destroyed in the 70s due to the licensing company filing for bankruptcy, the full dub has since been restored for a DVD release by Right Stuff Anime. Astro Boy begins with the young son of a famous scientist, Tenma Tobio, getting in a car accident almost immediately and just straight up dying. His father processes his grief in the only way he knows how, by building a robot boy to replace his dead son. Astro Boy lives with Dr. Tenma for years, leading a seemingly normal childhood, until one day his father realizes that he isn't growing like a normal boy. So he just sells Astro to a really creepy Italian dude named the Great Cacciatore in the dub, who turns out to be a crazed robot circus master. Astro spends some time at the circus where he fights other robots, but won't go through with destroying them. Eventually, he is saved by the kind-hearted robot activist, Dr. Ochana Mizu, and from there he goes to fight evil in the form of giant monsters and other robots. Astro Boy notably changed many of the names in the English language version. Obviously the main one being changing Atom to Astro, but there are some other sillier and even weirder ones. For one, Tobio Tenma was changed to Aster Boynton, which I assume they only picked because it sounds kind of close to Astro Boy. Achanomizu is also renamed Dr. Pachydermis J. Elephun, which is a mouthful, or maybe I should say a noseful.
Allow me to introduce myself. I am Pachydermis J. Elephant, new head of the Institute of Science.
The animation in Astro Boy is actually pretty impressive. Sure, there are a lot of scenes that are pretty much just stills, but then there are these bursts of motion and some really beautiful lighting and strong as hell character design. Obviously, Astro Boy was a huge hit back in the day, and as such, it's gone on to inspire pretty much every anime ever. Tezuka's style was synonymous with manga and anime for so many years that you can still point out its influence in shows released today. Now, I don't think I would want to sit down for the whole 100+ episodes and watch all of Astro Boy, especially when there are other adaptations out there that are a bit more modern, but the 60s show has some great stuff in it, like this scene where Astro has to charge up another robot by plugging a cord up its ass.
Where is it? On my hip, but I feel a trifle silly. I'm ticklish.
Tetsujin 28 Go, better known to Western audiences as Gigantor, is a 1963 adaptation of a 50s manga of the same name. Originally a story about a giant remote-controlled robot that was built to help the Japanese win World War II, only to be passed down to a young boy when the war came to an end, the series was heavily edited when brought to the US. For one, the whole post-war setting was thrown right out the window, with the time period jumping forward all the way to the year 2000, along with toning down the violence and changing the names of the characters to things like Jimmy Sparks and Bob Brilliant. It is notable that the dub was created by a man named Fred Ladd, a TV producer that was responsible for the adaptation of Astro Boy. Apparently, Ladd saw some sort of promo artwork of a giant robot that was originally made by Mitsuru Tokoyama, the mangaka that originally created Tetsujin 28. Ladd was so enthralled by the artwork that he hunted down the series and decided to adapt it for American audiences. Say what you will about the practice of taking one work and heavily changing it to appeal to a different audience, but Fred Ladd really knew how to hunt down series that would appeal to Western kids back in the day. Because there's such a huge difference between Gigantor and the original Tetsujin 28, I watched a bit of both versions and wow man, what a trip that was. For one, I started watching the English language Gigantor first, and this show just throws you right into the world with zero explanation. I guess they didn't care to adapt the backstories of the characters in this one, and it opens with a 2-episode arc with Jimmy Sparks and his friends foiling the plans of the evil Dr. Catsmeow in Antarctica. There's a lot more actual movement than in earlier works such as Astro Boy, and Gigantor still has that quality where they were really trying hard to match the cadence of their voice to the lip flaps of the scenes. It's not as apparent as in something like Speed Racer, perhaps the most infamous and memed example of this, but it does come off as really funny. Especially in scenes where characters just scream a bunch or do random things like steal a cop's car and then say it was a joke.
Come back here with my car! Well, hello everybody. Dick, it's Dick Strong. Just a minute. Speak up, Dick. Why'd you take my car? Cool it. Take it easy. Take it easy? You go hot rodding in my car and you tell me to take it easy?
Sure, I can't speed up on the road. It's illegal.
Very funny.
The writing comes off so weird because they have to introduce these characters like Dick Strong, a guy who just shows up, steals Inspector Blooper's cop car, and then brings it back, and they're all just like, well, that's Dick Strong for you, ha ha ha. Bro, I don't know who Dick Strong is. This is the weirdest introduction for a character ever. Not to mention, we're introduced to the lead, Jimmy, when a cop bursts through his door and yells at him about going to the South Pole, and he's all like, okay, let's go. It's all very surreal, and in this day and age, it's very obvious that the studio was trying to make a new story out of something that already existed. like trying to sculpt a statue out of a different statue. And I didn't get to talk about the actual giant robot who shows up halfway through the episode with no explanation. I mean, he's just there. But back in 60s America, I guess it didn't really matter. In contrast to the original version, Tetsujin 28 Go starts with Jimmy, named Shotaro here, his father just dying and telling him to grow up and be a strong and respectable man. Shotaro is then taken to his father's lab where he's given the remote control to the giant robot Tetsujin. Tetsujin is almost stolen and has to fight a giant monster, and while it's run-of-the-mill by today's standards, compared to Gigantor, there's a pretty deep story here. It's really interesting how different it actually is, and if I were to sit down and really watch it, I would probably go with the original Japanese version. I also really love the use of the color black in the show's color palette. Tetsujin himself is always heavily shaded, and it just gives a lot of depth to the scene and his character design. Personally, I think it's more visually striking than even Astro Boy. All in all, Gigantor / Tetsujin 28 is a pretty interesting piece of history, as well as being the progenitor of the giant robot genre. So it's no wonder that the franchise has a lasting legacy over 40 years later. 1966 would see the release of yet another mecha manga adaptation in the form of Toei Animation's Cyborg 009. The original manga was created by Shotaro Ishinomori, the man who is also responsible for the incredibly long-running Super Sentai. Of course, he also worked on Astro Boy, and the similarities between that work and his own venture in Cyborg 009 are fairly obvious. But where Astro was a full robot built from the ground up, 009 is a cyborg, constructed from the body of professional race car driver Joe Shimamura after a deadly accident. Joe becomes the titular Cyborg 009, a superhuman fighter created by the evil organization Black Ghost in order to use him in their dastardly schemes. Before the plans can get underway, Joe escapes and joins with a team of 8 other cyborgs and the sympathetic Dr. Gilbert in order to take down Black Ghost and its enigmatic leader. Of the 3 properties that we've talked about so far, Cyborg 009 is probably the most complicated and nuanced right off the bat, with a really interesting world and distinctive character designs. And about the character designs, let me just get this one out of the way. This character is Cyborg 008, and his design is obviously a really bad racial stereotype right out of the 1960s. Funnily enough, Cyborg 009 was actually a really progressive show for its time, which pushed the values of social acceptance and equality. But yeah, that character design did not age well. At the very least, 008 got some good redesigns way down the road in later reboots. Thank God. The 1966 movie covers the opening arc of the manga and runs only a little over 60 minutes. The movie is also notably in color, and while there are a lot of scenes where the coloring's a little flat with a lack of shading, it still does look pretty good in some places. There isn't a ton of story packed into the relatively short runtime, but what is here is a pretty fun story with a ton of action. A large cast doesn't exactly get fleshed out in this movie on its own, but Cyborg 009 would go on to have a ton more content with only a minimal amount of time between its early releases. Only 1 year later, in 1967, another 60-minute film further detailing the adventures of the rebellious cyborgs would be released. Monster Wars is a rough adaptation of the Cyborg 009 manga's second arc, and sees the team reuniting and venturing to a secret underground lair to finally defeat Black Ghost. As a setting, Monster Wars is a lot weirder. I mean, the movie starts with dinosaurs screaming at ships until they explode. It's really imaginative. Eventually, these cyborgs board this exploration ship to try and make it to the Black Ghost base, and they fight off big jellyfish and a bunch of weird monsters. The Black Ghost leader in this movie is a giant eagle statue with a human body. It's actually metal as hell. This movie is such a trip, it's honestly a shame more people haven't seen it. Finally, in 1968, Toei released a 26-episode TV series simply titled Cyborg 009. While some of the character designs would be changed from the films to better reflect the design from the original manga, the TV series would actually go on to tell its own original story. While still echoing the themes of the original work, the show would actually have a few episodes that would get banned for drawing direct comparisons from events in the show to the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This made the show rather notorious among Japanese parents at the time, and a ton of pressure was put on the production team to tone down the violence and themes to make it a little bit more appropriate to younger audiences. This actually caused the team to voluntarily end the run at only 26 episodes, which is pretty short back then, because they didn't want their creative vision to be compromised. And I think there's something really admirable about that. It seems like Cyborg 009 takes a lot of the weirdness from Monster Wars, because the show starts with an episode where two evil scientists are trying to enlarge humans in order to create an army of giants to take over the world. It's wacky, and there's a scene where a giant rat attacks a prison, which I was not expecting. The show takes a Monster of the Week approach to its stories and has some multi-part arcs over its relatively short runtime. While the movies were in full color, this show was broadcast in black and white, but animation at this point had gotten to a much more fluid level, and the 1968 series is a pretty fun watch. While this is the last I'll be talking about Cyborg 009 today, rest assured this series will continue to pop up in the future time and time again. The final entry into this 1960s mecha extravaganza is a theatrical release once again by Toei. Flying Phantom Ship, also known as the Flying Ghost Ship, details the sad tale of a young boy named Hayato who loses both his parents during a giant robot attack. Hayato swears revenge against the Phantom Ship that commands the giant robot, and then works with a man named Kuroshiro to take down the ship. But of course not all is as it seems, and this movie has its fair share of twists and turns throughout its hour-long runtime. Phantom Ship was just released on Blu-ray by Discotek Media in 2022, and hey, they even made a dub of it. Hell, this movie was actually the first Japanese anime released in Russian theaters, so it seems like this little piece of mecha history has a lot bigger of a legacy than I thought. The animation for the huge robot was done by Hayao Miyazaki of Studio Ghibli fame, and even beyond his work on this particular aspect, the movie looks really good. Flying Phantom Ship starts out with some wholesome family fun, and immediately I noticed that Hayato's dad looks like a cross between Bob Pataki from Hey Arnold and Professor Oak. Is it just me? After a day out fishing, the family witness a car accident that happens to involve the owner of the company that Hayato's father works for. The family takes the victims to the creepiest haunted house that has ever been committed to animation. Inside, they come across a very spooky skeleton, and we get some great frames of the characters running away. Man, I know I'm poking fun, but this movie looks so good. I'm honestly astonished at the atmosphere that Phantom Ship pulls off. The skeleton ghost spooks the family and tells them that the Phantom Ship has been summoned due to its insatiable thirst for revenge, and then it just pieces out and everything goes back to normal. Only for the city to be attacked by a giant robot that announces it is the Phantom Ship's harbinger of death. Things take a really dark turn from here on out, and Phantom Ship stays consistently entertaining while also being somber and dark for its relatively short hour-long runtime. So yeah, I had never even heard of this movie before deciding to do research for this video, and it sort of ended up being my favorite thing that I talked about. And I didn't even get to mention the giant crab that shows up later on. If this one piqued your interest at all, I'd say give it a shot. And as of right now, the whole movie is uploaded on YouTube, so you can just go and watch it for free. You can also check out the dub and the remastered Blu-ray as well, so there's no shortage of ways to check out this underrated piece of anime cinema. And there we have a selection of 6 pieces of mecha media from the early days of the genre. I got this idea from seeing comments on videos that bring up the fact that many people won't watch anime or even any other media from before a certain year or time frame, saying it's just too old. I've always seen that as quite a big shame, because Older anime and the value that it still brings to the art form is incredibly important. While broadening my horizons and looking into these older shows, I got this really strange, disconnected feeling. Maybe it's because there's an almost haunting nature to watching something that was made 40 or 50 years ago, knowing that it was created by people from a completely different generation, with incredibly different experiences from my own. If you enjoyed this look back to the origins of the themes that we now see all over the place, then please leave a comment letting me know, because the more people like this, the more likely I am to do more installments in the future. This was certainly a fun video to work on and write, and I hope that you enjoyed and might take a look at one of these older properties as well. If this does do well, then I plan on moving on to look at the early 70s, and eventually we'd have to go year by year because the 70s and 80s were slammed full of Mecha. Thank you for taking the time to watch today, and I will see you all very soon. Hey there, and welcome to today's end card. Let's start off right by thanking the channel members, aka Batosai, Argent, Griever, Brian Sanchez, D. Mells, Daniel Johnson, Danky Stank, Swanky Mank, Gert, Joe Castellanos, John Lamb, Johnny G, Canto 20, McLean Nugent, Trey Hardy, Video Game Player 75, and Yo-Yo Mitch. Thank you guys very much for continuing to support the channel. It is incredibly appreciated, especially now that summer has rolled around. I've been feeling a little bit less depressed. So I've been putting out more content that I hope you guys enjoy. This one was a really fun one to work on, just looking at all of these different anime that are super old that I've never really had a chance to look at. But you know, this being what I like to do, I probably should have some sort of idea about the roots of the genre and such. So this is something that I've actually been working on since February, at least, pre-production, idea space type working on it. So it's been something I've wanted to do for a while, as well as the game reviews that are kind of coming back. So again, I hope you guys really enjoyed that. Like I said, please let me know if you do, because the more people that enjoy it, the more likely I am to do these more often. And like I said in the video, I started doing the 60s because there's only a couple shows. The video's 20-ish minutes long, but once we get to 1986, there's 15 mecha shows. So surprisingly, the 2000s, the early 2000s has a shit ton of mecha stuff in it. So that's also going to be long. So we're going to have to go there might be a couple of years where if I get to them, I have to do 2 videos per year, because there's just so many shows to look at. Yeah, anyway, that's pretty much it. Look out for Gundam Unicorn, and I think we're going to split the Ray Earth video into 2 videos, one for each season, because the seasons are just really different from each other, and I think that it deserves two videos breaking down both seasons, so I can kind of compare and contrast them. Other than that, I'm going to go back to playing Tears of the Kingdom. So, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next week. Have a good one.